Hello, I'm Venus, and my family has always carried secrets darker than anyone could imagine. Last night, at Dad's party, he asked me casually, "Did you move into the villa yet?" I froze. Villa? What villa? My sister went pale. Mom hissed, "Don't you dare ask!" And Dad's eyes, they burned straight through her. That moment shattered everything I thought I knew. How could they hide something so close, so important, right under my nose? And as the truth began to explode, I realized this wasn't just about a house. It was about every lie, every betrayal, every plan I'd been kept from. But finally, I wasn't powerless anymore. I stepped out of my car and paused for a moment, taking in the familiar facade of Dad's mansion. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway, and the scent of freshly mown grass mingled with the faint aroma of barbecue from the patio. Even after all these years, the place felt both comforting and suffocating at the same time. I adjusted the strap of my bag and took a deep breath. Today was Dad's birthday party, a gathering that was always polite on the surface but teeming with unspoken tensions beneath. I had rehearsed a smile, but it already felt strained before I even walked through the front door. As I entered the grand hall, I was met with the familiar hum of voices, laughter slightly forced, clinking glasses, and the echo of high ceilings that seemed to amplify every tiny inflection. Celine, my older sister, was leaning against the marble banister, perfectly poised, as if the room revolved around her. Her gaze flicked to me, cold and measured, and I felt the usual twinge of irritation. Mom hovered nearby, whispering something to Dad, her eyes flicking toward me before darting away. I reminded myself, stay calm. Observe first. Dad, ever the patriarch with his commanding presence, spotted me from across the room. His smile was warm, but the glint in his eyes suggested a message I wasn't prepared for. He gestured me over, and I approached cautiously. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Did you move into the villa yet?" I froze mid-step, my thoughts crashing over one another. Villa? What villa? I heard myself mumble silently in disbelief. My pulse quickened, confusion and dread coiling in my stomach. How could I have missed something this significant? Celine's face went pale, and I caught a fleeting flash of panic in her otherwise controlled demeanor. Mom hissed sharply, "Don't you dare ask!" her voice carrying the weight of a warning more severe than anything Dad had said. I realized in that instant that the villa was some secret, some hidden truth that I had no part in, and yet the curiosity it sparked in me refused to be smothered. I retreated to a corner near the stairwell, pretending to adjust my bracelet while my mind raced. Memories of past family gatherings flickered in my head, the subtle dismissals, the whispered conversations that always excluded me, the silent judgment when I tried to speak up. For years, I had been the youngest, the one everyone overlooked, the one whose opinions were softened or ignored. And now, this villa, whatever it was, seemed like the final proof that I had been sidelined again. The rising tension gnawed at me. I noticed Dad's subtle glances, the way he avoided looking directly at Celine. Something was clearly amiss. And then, as if the universe had decided to tease me further, I found it. A small, neatly folded envelope tucked inside one of the decorative planters by the entrance. My heart skipped. The envelope was addressed to me, in Dad's unmistakable handwriting, but the handwriting seemed different somehow, more urgent, almost pleading. Inside, a letter hinted at ownership of the villa, mentioning legal documents, secret agreements, and a will clause that no one had ever disclosed. My hands trembled slightly as I read, anxiety and a strange spark of curiosity intertwining. This revelation was like a door opening into a room I had been barred from entering all my life. I retreated further, finding a quiet seat on a leather chair near the fireplace, my mind racing. Venus, I thought to myself, always overlooked, always underestimated. But now, perhaps there was leverage here. Perhaps there was a way to finally assert myself without causing an outright family war. I remembered a note from Dad years ago, praising my honesty and intelligence. That memory, a small beacon in the storm, felt like a mo neo hai vong, a lifeline I could cling to in the chaos of family deception. If I played this carefully, If I observed and waited, I might have the tools to navigate this treacherous terrain. As evening fell, the golden light shifted to a dim amber through the tall windows, and the first stars began to appear over Houston's skyline. The party continued around me, laughter and chatter blending into a background hum, almost oblivious to my inner turmoil. I watched Celine move gracefully among the guests, seemingly unaffected, but I could feel the undercurrent of tension in her eyes when she glanced my way. I sipped my drink slowly, my mind methodically piecing together what I knew, what I suspected, and what I still needed to discover. Something was off, undeniably off. I couldn't ignore it, couldn't pretend this was just another family drama. I needed to know the truth about this villa, about the secrets my family had kept from me all these years. Finally, I stood, smoothing the front of my blouse, and forced a calm expression onto my face. I would investigate quietly, subtly. No one would see it coming. I would observe, gather information, and plan my next steps carefully. The tension coiled inside me, anticipation and fear warring for dominance, but the spark of determination flared brighter. I whispered to myself, almost as if to anchor my resolve. Something's off. I need to find out what's really going on. And with that thought, I moved toward the back hallway, away from the prying eyes of party guests, toward the library where Dad kept many of his private papers. Each step felt like crossing into a world I had been denied, each breath a mixture of excitement and dread. The villa, the secret, the truth, it all awaited, hidden in plain sight. The evening had settled over Houston like a heavy curtain, muting the last traces of sunlight across the city. I drove home slowly, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, the villa question echoing relentlessly in my mind. The party's polite chatter, Dad's penetrating gaze, Celine's pale expression, all of it lingered in my thoughts as I navigated the familiar streets toward my apartment. I couldn't help but feel that the comfortable patterns of my life were unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of family secrets I had never known existed. Once inside my apartment, I set my bag down and sank into the leather chair near the window, letting the quiet hum of the air conditioning fill the room. I pulled out the stack of papers and the envelope I had taken from Dad's study earlier. Spreading them across the coffee table, I began sorting through emails, letters, and notes, anything that might give me a clue about this mysterious villa. Each document was a small puzzle piece, and the more I read, the clearer it became that Celine had been manipulating Dad's decisions for years, ensuring she had the upper hand in ways I had barely noticed until now. A memory flared up unbidden. I was 10, sitting at the kitchen table, excited to share my science project with Dad, only to be brushed off with a distracted, "Not now, Venus, your sister needs me." That moment, trivial at the time, now felt like the first thread in a tapestry of favoritism and subtle betrayals. Every time I trusted my family, I ended up overlooked or blamed, my efforts dismissed while Celine's achievements were celebrated with fanfare. The villa, the secrecy, it was all part of a pattern I had only now begun to recognize. Rising anger coiled in my chest as I discovered more evidence. Emails between Celine and Dad detailing the villa purchase, financial arrangements, and deliberate omissions in the family ledger. It was all there, black and white, yet hidden behind the guise of casual conversation and polite smiles. My heart pounded as I realized the extent of Celine's favoritism, and I knew I couldn't confront her blindly. I needed proof, a strategy, something that would allow me to speak without fear of being dismissed or accused of overreacting. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow, controlled breath. "I can't let this go," I whispered to myself. "Not this time. I need to be seen." That thought alone steadied me, gave me a quiet determination that simmered beneath the surface of my frustration. I knew Celine well enough to predict some of her reactions, her subtle smirks, her carefully measured words, her ability to make me feel like a child even in my 30s. But I was no longer a passive observer in her game. My phone buzzed, jolting me out of my spiraling thoughts. It was Marlene, my best friend from work. I answered immediately, grateful for a familiar voice. "Hey, Venus, everything okay? You seemed off earlier," she said, her tone casual yet concerned. I hesitated, then decided to confide lightly, careful not to reveal too much. Just family stuff. You know how it is. Uh-huh, Marlene replied knowingly. Listen, sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous when pushed. Just remember, you've got more power than they think. Her words settled over me like a warm blanket, a reminder that support existed outside the suffocating walls of my family home. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bolster my resolve. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk, laptop open, replaying Dad's question, Celine's expressions, Mom's whispered warnings. I cross-referenced emails, noted inconsistencies, and made mental lists of allies and potential witnesses. Every detail mattered. By the time I finally allowed myself to stretch out on the sofa, the city lights casting shadows across my apartment, I had a plan forming in the back of my mind. I would confront Celine subtly, gather evidence carefully, and ensure that when the truth came to light, it could no longer be denied. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by flashes of past family dinners, hushed phone calls I'd overheard, and the sharp sting of realization that my own family had conspired to keep me in the dark. And yet, beneath the tension, a quiet thrill ran through me, the knowledge that for the first time, I might finally have a way to claim my place, to assert my voice, and to finally be acknowledged for who I truly was. The next morning, I returned to the mansion, ostensibly to spend a few hours tidying up after the party and exchanging pleasantries with family friends. My movements were deliberate, careful not to reveal the storm of thoughts brewing beneath the surface. I watched Celine interact with the guests, her polished demeanor hiding the calculating mind I had come to know too well. I could almost see the chessboard in my mind, each piece representing a conversation, a gesture, or a withheld truth. As the day wore on, I stole moments to slip away, retreating to corners and hallways to review the evidence once more. Each time I read a document, I felt a mixture of shock, disbelief, and growing satisfaction. The pieces were finally falling into place. And with each revelation, my understanding of the villa's significance deepened. This wasn't merely about property, it was about recognition, fairness, and the right to be included in decisions that had always excluded me. By late afternoon, I had mapped out a mental strategy. I would wait for the next family gathering, choose my words carefully, and confront Celine in a way that forced her hand without giving her the chance to twist the narrative. It would be delicate, calculated, and deliberate. I would be the one in control this time. The sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting the mansion in a golden glow that shimmered against the windows. I stood near the staircase, observing Celine laughing with Dad and Mom, and I realized something profound. I was ready. The villa was just the beginning. This was about reclaiming my voice, my place in the family, and finally demanding the respect I had been denied for decades. As the evening settled into a quiet hush, I glanced at my phone one more time. A message from Marlene popped up. Remember, sometimes the quietest voice echoes the loudest. I smiled faintly, feeling the truth of her words resonate in my chest. The following weekend, the sun hung low in the Houston sky, painting the streets in shades of gold and amber. I parked my car in the familiar driveway of the family mansion, a place that had always felt both comforting and confining. Each visit felt like walking into a carefully curated theater, where everyone knew their lines except me, or so they thought. I adjusted my jacket, took a deep breath, and reminded myself that I was no longer the passive youngest daughter who could be quietly overlooked. Today, I had a plan, and every subtle action would matter. Inside, the mansion smelled of polished wood and lingering perfume from the previous night's party. The faint hum of conversation floated down the hall from the living room, where Celine was already mingling with our parents and a few family friends. She laughed lightly at something Dad had said, her eyes glinting with smug confidence, the perfect mask of superiority I'd come to recognize. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the anticipation of the conversation I had been meticulously rehearsing in my mind for hours. She had no idea I was prepared. I lingered near the doorway, observing, cataloging every expression, every flicker of movement. Celine leaned close to Dad, whispering something that made him smile, and I felt the old, familiar twinge of exclusion. But this time, I refused to let it paralyze me. I had notes, emails, and memories carefully organized. My strategy was simple yet precise. I would probe, observe, and record reactions, never giving away more than I had to. The villa question was my opening, but it wasn't the end game. It was the key to revealing a pattern of favoritism and deception that had long been buried. As I stepped forward to join the conversation, I kept my tone light, casual. "So, Dad," I began, careful to sound curious rather than confrontational, "I was wondering about the villa. Is there anything I should know?" Celine's head snapped slightly, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. A slip I noted immediately. Her eyes, usually so calculating, betrayed a hint of hesitation. I continued, letting the pause stretch just long enough to create subtle pressure. I only ask because I want to understand how decisions are being made. I feel like there's so much I've missed. Dad blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Well, Venus, that's a conversation for another time," he said, his voice even but guarded. Celine interjected smoothly, "Oh, Venus, don't worry about it. Everything's handled. You wouldn't want to get involved in adult matters anyway." Her tone was saccharine, dismissive, the exact kind of condescension I had endured for years. I nodded, smiling faintly, but inside I was noting every nuance, every inflection. This was twist S5, the first real crack in Celine's armor. She had revealed, unintentionally, that there was more beneath her carefully constructed facade. I kept my composure, jotting mental notes, cataloging evidence in real time. Mom's eyes flicked toward me, sharp and warning, a reminder that while I was gaining momentum, the family's subtle power dynamics were alive and vigilant. I acknowledged the glance with a slight tilt of my head, signaling nothing, absorbing everything. The villa was more than property. It was a symbol, a pivot point, a source of authority Celine had wielded with precision. Later that afternoon, I found an excuse to slip out to the nearby cafe, claiming a sudden craving for coffee, though the real purpose was to regroup, review the emails, and solidify my approach. The quiet corner I claimed became my war room. I spread the documents across the table, cross-referencing emails, letters, and notes. Patterns emerged. Funds moved subtly. Decisions favored Celine. Dad's responses tailored to her requests. It wasn't just about the villa. It was about control, hierarchy, and the unspoken rules that had governed our family for years. Twist S6 emerged as I reviewed a particularly telling email chain. Celine had actively sought to manipulate Dad's perception of my involvement, implying that I was either indifferent or incapable of handling responsibility. My chest tightened at the audacity, yet a thrill ran through me. For the first time, I recognized a vulnerability in her narrative, a chink in the armor she had relied upon for so long. Returning to the mansion later that evening, I felt a shift in the air. Dinner was a casual affair, though tension simmered beneath polite conversation. Celine, sensing perhaps that I had been probing, tilted her head slightly, her smile just a touch sharper. "I suppose some things aren't meant for you to understand, Venus," she said softly, her tone both warning and provocative. I let her words slide past, storing them in my memory, noting every reaction. Dad excused himself to make a call, leaving Celine and me alone for a moment. I chose my words carefully, gently leading the conversation. "Celine, I'd like to understand more about the villa. I feel like I'm missing something important." Her eyes narrowed, calculating. "You don't really want to get involved, Venus. This isn't for everyone. Some decisions are delicate." Delicate, a word loaded with implication. I smiled politely, but inside, I bristled. Her attempt to gaslight me was transparent. I didn't need to argue. I simply nodded, letting the comment hang, all the while cataloging her posture, tone, and hesitations. This was strategic observation, the beginning of my reversal. As the evening wore on, I found brief opportunities to step aside, review notes in my phone, mentally mapping the evidence and planning the next steps. Every interaction, every nuance, became a piece of the puzzle. The mansion, which had always felt suffocating, now became a field of subtle maneuvers, a space where I could assert control quietly, invisibly, but decisively. By nightfall, the household had settled into a quieter rhythm. I lingered in the library, reviewing the villa documentation once more, my resolve hardening. This wasn't just about proving Celine's manipulation. It was about asserting my voice, claiming my rightful place in family decisions, and ensuring that the patterns of exclusion would no longer dictate my life. I paused by the window, watching the city lights flicker below, a sense of clarity washing over me. Each step I had taken, each careful observation, had brought me closer to the leverage I needed. I realized, with a mixture of apprehension and exhilaration, that the villa was only the beginning. Every choice they thought I'd never question, every slight I had endured, could now be addressed strategically, with precision. The morning sunlight slanted through the tall windows of the family estate, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. I lingered in the quiet of the hallway, replaying Celine's subtle smirks and dismissive gestures from the previous day. Every glance, every carefully placed word had been a test, and I knew she had been sizing me up just as deliberately. But this time, I wouldn't be caught off guard. After breakfast, while the household staff moved quietly about their duties, I retreated to the private study, my sanctuary, my strategic headquarters. And the room smelled faintly of aged books and cedar polish. I opened my notebook and began reviewing my notes from yesterday's interactions. My pulse was steady, but my mind raced with possibilities. Celine had underestimated me, and I was determined to exploit the smallest openings. I recalled my father's occasional praise from years ago, when I had been honest and thoughtful as a teenager, often overlooked by Celine's constant interference. Those rare affirmations had stayed with me, a reminder that I was capable, that I could hold my ground if I approached matters with intelligence rather than emotion. The villa was the surface. The deeper game was about family control, hidden manipulations, and the subtle power plays I had been blind to for too long. Late that afternoon, I caught sight of Celine lounging in the drawing room, pretending to read while throwing occasional sidelong glances at the study door. Her posture, the faint curl of her lips, spoke volumes. She believed I wouldn't confront her directly. I waited, measuring my moment, until finally I rose and walked toward her, my footsteps deliberately soft but confident. "Celine," I began, my voice calm yet edged with controlled firmness. "I know there's more than you're telling, and I won't be silenced." Her head lifted slowly, surprise flashing across her features for a fraction of a second before she masked it with a small, mocking smile. "Venus," she said, her tone casual but dripping with amusement. "You always think you're in charge of understanding everything. Some things are just out of reach." I noted every twitch, every hesitation. She believed this comment would intimidate me, but instead it strengthened my resolve. "Out of reach?" I replied lightly. "I've been patient, but patience only goes so far. I'm willing to listen, but I expect honesty." Dad appeared at the doorway then, silent and watching, his eyes unreadable. There was a weight in his gaze that made my stomach twist, like standing on a precipice, knowing one misstep could send me plummeting. But I steadied myself, drawing from my father's past praise, and reminded myself that careful strategy could turn even the most precarious situation to my advantage. Celine smirked, leaning back slightly, as though daring me to press further. "Venus, some games are best left alone. You're still learning." I allowed a small, measured laugh, one that hinted at understanding but masked the full extent of my insight. "Learning is one thing. Being left in the dark is another. I won't be dismissed this time." My words were soft, but their implication was clear. I had noticed her schemes, and I was prepared to counter them. Over the next few hours, the household shifted around us. The staff moved silently, tending to mundane tasks, oblivious to the subtle psychological duel unfolding. I retreated to the study briefly, documenting our conversation, noting the tone, body language, and subtle inflections. Every detail could serve as leverage later, a small weapon in the ongoing contest for transparency and fairness. Then came the twist, the subtle escalation I had anticipated but was still unsettling. Celine, perhaps sensing the growing challenge I posed, began whispering to certain family friends who had stopped by for tea. I overheard fragments Phrases designed to paint me as naive or overly ambitious, remarks carefully tailored to undermine my credibility without direct confrontation. She was attempting to manipulate perception subtly, to erode the support I might find outside our immediate family. I paused, taking a steadying breath. This was twist S7, the moment that confirmed my instincts. She would not yield without a fight, and the battle was no longer just about the villa. It was about reputation, perception, and control. I reminded myself of my plan: observation, documentation, measured responses, and timing. Every move had to be deliberate. Any overt confrontation could backfire. In the quiet of my study later that evening, I reviewed my notes and compiled a timeline of Celine's recent actions. Her strategies were predictable in their cunning, but flawed in execution. She assumed I lacked patience, that I would react emotionally. I had the advantage of clarity and calm, the ability to wait for the right moment to expose inconsistencies. My mind wandered briefly to the rare occasions Dad had shown faith in my judgment. Those memories, small as they were, became anchors for my strategy, proof that I was not alone in understanding or intelligence. Dinner was a subdued affair, with an unspoken tension stretching across the table. Celine's attempts to sway perception continued in subtle ways, exchanging glances, raising eyebrows, directing minor comments toward family friends. I remained outwardly composed, taking mental notes, allowing her to believe she still controlled the narrative. Inside, however, a spark of satisfaction glimmered. The more she underestimated me, the greater the eventual revelation would be. After the meal, I excused myself to the study, reviewing the documentation once more. My plan was taking shape. I would confront Celine not with anger or accusation, but with calm, undeniable evidence of her manipulations. I could see the trajectory clearly now. Every slight, every insinuation, every dismissal could be addressed methodically, reshaping the family dynamic subtly but irrevocably. As night fell, I looked out the study window at the Houston skyline, lights twinkling like distant stars. The villa was only a symbol. The real challenge was navigating the undercurrents of deception, favoritism, and hidden ambitions that had long dictated our family's hierarchy. For the first time, I felt the quiet thrill of empowerment. I was no longer a passive observer. I was a participant in shaping the outcome, armed with knowledge, patience, and a determination that could not be easily dismissed. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the grand windows of the Houston estate, casting a golden haze over the polished surfaces of the living room. I lingered near the fireplace, flipping through my notebook once more, reviewing the notes I had taken since yesterday. Every glance Celine had thrown my way, every subtle smirk, every whispered insinuation, had been documented. I could feel the weight of anticipation settling in my chest, an energy that was part fear, part adrenaline. I reminded myself that the villa wasn't just a property. It was the symbol of power and trust, the instrument of favoritism and deception. Celine had played this game for years, manipulating both Dad and family friends with careful precision. But today, I would refuse to be sidelined. I would confront her, calmly but decisively, and I would do so in a way that left no room for ambiguity. As the house hummed with the soft sounds of staff moving about, I noticed Celine reclining on the sofa, pretending to read a magazine, though her eyes darted toward the doorway whenever I shifted. That little twitch of her brow, the curl of her lips, it all confirmed what I already knew. She believed she was untouchable. I allowed myself a quiet smile, inwardly acknowledging that underestimating me had always been her mistake. When Dad appeared in the hallway, his gaze briefly met mine. There was no word, no warning, only that measured, inscrutable expression of his, the one I had studied as a child, hoping to glean insight into his moods. I took a deep breath, knowing that any misstep in front of him would be magnified. I moved toward Celine, slow enough to appear casual, deliberate enough to command attention. "Celine," I said, voice steady but carrying a subtle edge. "Your games won't work this time. I see through everything you try to hide." Her eyes flicked up, surprise evident for just a fraction of a second before the carefully constructed mask of innocence returned. "Venus," she replied, her tone sugary sweet, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. "You always assume you understand more than you do. Some things are just beyond your reach." I let the words hang in the air, letting her believe she was intimidating me while mentally logging each nuance, the hesitation in her delivery, the subtle tightening of her jaw. Beyond my reach? I countered lightly. I've observed, I've documented, and I've listened. Some things may have been hidden before, but I'm not blind anymore. Mom's nervous glance from the dining area reminded me that this confrontation had ripple effects. She was watching closely, perhaps hoping for reconciliation, perhaps fearing escalation. Dad remained silent, the storm behind his eyes hidden, but I sensed the tension. Each member of my family had a role to play, and I was beginning to understand how the pieces moved. Celine shifted slightly, her posture a mix of defiance and calculation. "Venus, you really believe you can challenge me without consequence?" she said, her voice low enough to sound intimate, yet loud enough for anyone nearby to overhear. The subtle implication, one of danger, one of leverage, was clear. I stayed calm, letting her words land without reaction. Internally, I catalogued her threats and weaknesses. My strategy was already forming: patience, evidence, timing. I would not allow emotions to dictate my moves. Instead, I would turn each of her gestures into proof of intent. Over the next hour, as family friends trickled in for casual afternoon tea, Celine made her moves. She whispered to Aunt Marianne, then to one of Dad's old colleagues, casting subtle doubts about me, portraying me as overconfident, reckless, perhaps even naive. I could feel the pressure rising in the room, a web of insinuation and manipulation designed to isolate me. I responded with composure, offering small, deliberate corrections, neutral comments that subtly undercut her narrative. Each word was measured, each smile carefully calibrated. I refused to react emotionally because every response I gave was recorded in my mental ledger, every detail a future lever of power. At one point, Celine leaned closer to whisper something directly in my ear, intending to provoke or unsettle me. I tilted my head slightly, letting her words flow over me without giving away a reaction. I made a mental note. She was desperate to regain the upper hand, which meant my presence, calm and assertive, was already disrupting her control. I moved to the adjacent patio as the sun began to dip, the warm air carrying a faint scent of jasmine from the gardens. The cool breeze offered clarity as I reflected on my next moves. I would need hard evidence, letters, emails, financial records, even old conversations that revealed her intentions. Only with these in hand could I decisively counteract the subtle social attacks she had been orchestrating. I recalled my mentor from years ago, someone who had always encouraged observation and patience, rather than hasty retaliation. Their voice echoed in my mind. The quiet ones, when prepared, are the most formidable. I let that thought anchor me. I was not alone. Support existed, both seen and unseen, in knowledge, experience, and those who had guided me before. As the sky darkened into deep purples and muted oranges, the living room lights flickered on, illuminating Celine's smug expression as she surveyed the gathering. I knew then that the villa and the games surrounding it were only the surface. This confrontation was larger, about perception, influence, and the subtle power dynamics that had long governed our family. The evening closed with a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. I retreated briefly to the study, reviewing the day's events. Each gesture, each comment, each whispered insinuation from Celine was now catalogued. My resolve hardened. I would not only defend myself, but reclaim the narrative. Every calculated move, every carefully preserved piece of evidence was a step toward exposing the truth, not just about the villa, but about long-buried family secrets. The evening had settled over the Houston estate with a quiet tension, the kind that pressed against your chest even in the stillness of the grand hallways. I lingered in the study, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating my notes and the carefully organized documents I had collected over the past days. Each paper, each highlighted passage, was a thread I planned to weave into a narrative that would finally confront Celine and reveal the subtle manipulations she had executed against me. I thought back to the events of earlier that day, how she had tried to undermine me in front of Dad and family friends, Her whispers, her thinly veiled insults, her casual smirks. Each had been calculated to make me appear small, naive, incapable. But I had remained composed, and now, with the quiet of the study wrapping around me, I could prepare for my own counterstrike. The memory of my mentor returned, the one who had always emphasized patience and precision over confrontation without strategy. Observe first, act decisively, and never let emotion dictate your hand. The words echoed in my mind. That counsel had guided me through countless professional battles, but tonight, it applied to something far more personal, protecting my reputation, my family ties, and the truth that Celine had tried to bury. I left the study and walked slowly through the hallways, the echoes of my footsteps merging with the faint murmur of conversations from the living room. On the patio, the sky was a deep violet, streaked with the last hints of sunset. Celine stood there, pretending to admire the garden, though I knew her gaze was fixed on me, calculating, anticipating. I stopped a few steps from her, letting the silence build before speaking. "Celine," I began, my voice steady yet firm. "I've gone over everything you've said, every story you've told about the villa. There are inconsistencies I can't ignore." Her posture stiffened, a flicker of defensiveness crossing her face before she recovered. "Inconsistencies?" she repeated, her tone deliberately questioning, as if trying to unsettle me. "I don't know what you mean." I stepped closer, letting my presence fill the space between us. "You've said one thing to Dad, another to Aunt Marianne, yet I have records, letters, emails, even conversations that don't align with your narrative. I'm not here to accuse without proof, but I am here to make sure the truth isn't buried." Her eyes narrowed, the first real crack in her confident demeanor appearing. "You think you can intimidate me with papers and notes?" she hissed. There was an edge of panic beneath her words, though she tried to mask it with bravado. "I'm not trying to intimidate," I replied softly, carefully controlling my tone. "I'm giving you a chance to be honest before it's too late. Your actions are being noticed, Celine, and your influence isn't as hidden as you believe." For a moment, the air between us was taut, almost electric. Then, I motioned for her to follow me back inside, leading her toward the living room where family friends were still lingering, unaware of the brewing storm. Dad was seated in his usual chair, observing the room with that unreadable expression that made my chest tighten every time I caught his gaze. Mom hovered nearby, a quiet anxiety in her posture. "Everyone," I began, addressing the small crowd, my voice calm but carrying authority. "I'd like to clarify some matters regarding the villa. There have been discrepancies in what has been presented to you, and I believe it's important to get the facts straight." Celine's lips pressed into a thin line, her attempt to regain control faltering as I subtly laid out hints of evidence without revealing the full scope, just enough to sow doubt in her narrative. Family friends exchanged glances, some leaning forward with curiosity, others shifting uncomfortably. She tried to interrupt, offering her own explanations, each one carefully crafted to deflect suspicion. But I anticipated her moves, cutting in with calm, deliberate counterpoints, highlighting contradictions without raising my voice. The psychological pressure mounted as I maintained control, refusing to rise to her provocations. And then it happened. One of Celine's minor allies, unaware of the full scope of my knowledge, let slip a detail about a transaction linked to the villa. Something that contradicted Celine's version and strengthened my position. I caught the comment, mentally noting the confirmation of what I had long suspected. The balance of perception was shifting. I could feel the subtle change in Dad's demeanor, a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps pride, or perhaps relief that the truth might finally surface. Mom's anxious expression softened slightly, a silent encouragement. I realized that my patience, my meticulous observations, and my strategic restraint were paying off. For the first time, I sensed a tangible turning point. As the evening progressed, the tension eased just enough for the family to continue their conversations, though undercurrents of unease lingered. Celine's smile no longer carried the same confidence. There was calculation now, a recognition that her control had weakened. I remained poised, observing every reaction, every micro-expression, knowing that this confrontation was far from over. I retreated to the study briefly, reviewing my notes and the details I had uncovered. My inner resolve strengthened. This wasn't about winning a petty argument. It was about reclaiming integrity, protecting my family, and ensuring that long-held manipulations did not dictate our future. The night deepened, and the house settled into a quieter rhythm. I stepped out onto the backyard terrace, the cool breeze brushing my face, bringing a clarity of thought that only nighttime could offer. I thought about the next steps, the strategic maneuvers I would need to implement, and the potential retaliation Celine might attempt. Patience and foresight would remain my allies, and I would not falter. The weight of the night pressed down on the Houston estate, the kind of stillness that carried an almost unbearable tension. Just moments ago, I had felt a fragile sense of control, thinking that Celine's next move might be manageable, but as I stepped into the main hall, the evidence of her planning was clear. Family friends lingered, half curious, half observant, unaware that a battle of wits and morality was about to unfold in their midst. I paused by the doorway, taking a steadying breath. Celine stood near the center of the room, feigning casual engagement with Dad, her lips curved into a practiced smile that did little to mask the sharp edge in her eyes. She was plotting something, I could sense it, and instinctively, my body tensed, my mind calculating every possible scenario. I moved closer, feigning disinterest, but my eyes tracked her subtle gestures, the slight turn of her hand, the barely perceptible glance toward family friends, the way she positioned herself to dominate the room. She intended a public humiliation, and I knew that if I waited, the damage could be irreversible. Tonight, in this room filled with people who mattered to both of us, the confrontation had to be precise. "Celine," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the murmur of conversation just enough to draw her attention. She blinked at me, feigning innocence, but there was a flash of recognition in her gaze. "We need to talk." She tilted her head, the polite mask firmly in place. "Of course," she said, her tone neutral but dripping with undercurrents I had learned to read over the years. I led her to a corner of the hall, just far enough from Dad to speak without being overheard, but still within earshot of those who might be witnesses. "I know what you're trying to do," I said, my voice calm but resolute, trying to manipulate perception, twisting facts about the villa, spreading doubts. "It stops tonight." Celine's posture stiffened. For the first time in our ongoing battle, I saw the faintest trace of unease. "You think you can stop me?" she asked, her words sharp, her tone a mixture of challenge and disbelief. "I don't think," I replied. "I know, and I have the proof to show it." Her eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing, but I didn't give her time to recover. I took a step back, signaling her to follow me toward Dad. Each movement was deliberate, a display of controlled power. Once we reached him, I addressed the room, allowing my voice to carry just enough for the assembled family and friends to take notice. "Dad, everyone," I began, keeping my tone composed, authoritative. "There's information you should know. Documents, messages, financial records that were deliberately hidden, evidence that shows the villa's management has been misrepresented." Celine's confident mask faltered. Her hand twitched slightly, betraying irritation. "Venus, this is unnecessary," she said, attempting to redirect attention, to frame me as overreacting, but the room's focus had already shifted. I presented the first piece of evidence, a folder containing a series of emails and letters, strategically curated to highlight inconsistencies in her previous statements. Eyes widened, murmurs rose. Dad leaned forward, expression unreadable but intent. Mom's hand subtly touched my arm, a quiet sign of support. Celine tried a verbal counterattack, her voice rising with frustration. "You're twisting the facts. You think a few papers can rewrite what's happened?" I responded calmly, deliberately, letting logic and clarity guide my words. "It's not about rewriting, Celine. It's about revealing the truth that's been ignored. Every detail matters. Every concealment you attempted can now be seen." Her frustration mounted visibly. She flailed verbally, attempting to sway the gathered friends, painting herself as the victim of my sudden accusations, but my counterpoints were precise, documented, irrefutable. Each time she spoke, I interjected with calm authority, systematically dismantling her narrative while maintaining my composure. Then it happened. Twist S11. In a moment of heightened agitation, Celine inadvertently confessed a deeper secret, a betrayal she had hoped no one would ever discover. Her admission, almost whispered, carried through the charged room. Manipulation, hidden dealings, motivations that had tormented our family for years. Gasps followed. Family members exchanged glances, the weight of her words reshaping the room's perception. I held my posture, calm, observing the shift. Sympathy subtly moved toward me. The mental and emotional balance was tipping, not just because of the proof I presented, but because the truth now had a voice, amplified by her own inadvertent confession. Dad's eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of something, approval, perhaps relief, passing between us. Mom exhaled quietly, a mixture of tension and quiet validation. I felt a surge of empowerment, not from triumph, but from the clarity that justice, when patiently pursued, could prevail even against manipulation and deceit. As the room settled into a tense silence, I reflected on the journey that had led here. The patience, the observation, the calculated actions. Every challenge, every subtle attempt at humiliation had been a stepping stone, and now the path forward was illuminated. The final confrontation was approaching, the resolution looming, and I knew that how I handled what came next would determine not just victory, but closure for all the underlying tensions that had plagued our family. The storm had started, not with a whisper, but with a low, rolling growl of thunder that shook the Houston estate. Rain lashed against the windows of the formal dining hall, a dark, drumming backdrop to the tension inside. I had stayed close to Dad's study for a moment after the events in the main hall, gathering my thoughts, reviewing the backup evidence I had held in reserve. Every document, every message, every witness account I had meticulously collected now felt heavy in my hands, a potential sword against years of deceit. I stepped into the dining hall just as Celine began her maneuver, smiling as though she held the upper hand. Her eyes flicked toward me, and I could almost see the calculation behind her poised gestures. She was ready to humiliate me, to sway opinion in her favor, and the room, filled with family, friends, and observers, was her stage. My pulse quickened, but my expression remained calm, strategic. I had waited for this moment, and I was prepared. Celine leaned slightly forward, addressing the room with a forced warmth. "Everyone, I think we've been misunderstanding Venus," she said, her voice smooth, aiming to cast doubt on my previous assertions. "I only ever wanted what's best for this family, and sometimes things, miscommunications, mistakes, happen." I took a step closer, intercepting the performance, letting my calm, deliberate voice cut through the murmurs. "Celine, let's not pretend that what's happening here is a miscommunication. We both know the truth has been obscured for a long time. It's not about mistakes, it's about deliberate concealment and manipulation." Eyes shifted. Friends exchanged uneasy glances. Mom's hand pressed against her chest, Dad's gaze sharpened, the storm outside echoing the rising tension inside. Celine's smile wavered for the first time. She attempted a subtle retort, but I continued, unfolding the first layer of proof. I produced a folder, its contents carefully organized, emails between Celine and certain estate staff, financial statements showing discrepancies, and letters she had intended to hide. Each piece was a quiet but undeniable accusation. The room's attention snapped to me. The murmurs grew into soft exclamations, disbelief mixing with curiosity. "Everyone here deserves to see the truth," I said steadily. "These documents show patterns of mismanagement and intentional concealment. I haven't been guessing. I've been observing, recording, and verifying. Tonight, the deception ends." Celine's face changed, subtle at first, then more apparent. Frustration flickered in her eyes, then something sharper, desperation. She attempted to regain control, raising her voice. "Venus, you think you can turn everyone against me with a few papers?" Her tone, once smooth, now carried a tremor. I met her gaze without flinching, continuing to outline the evidence, calmly, logically. Each statement I made revealed her patterns, her manipulations, her intent. The room's energy shifted. Where there had been tension, uncertainty, and doubt, now there was clarity, Observers leaned in, realizing that this wasn't a family squabble, but a confrontation with real stakes. Then came Twist S12. Among the documents was a witness statement from a longtime household staff member, accidentally left unsigned by Celine in a previous attempt to silence it. The staff member's account directly corroborated my assertions, detailing specific incidents where Celine had misrepresented facts to Dad and others. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as I read excerpts aloud. A hush fell. Even Celine's allies looked uneasy, glancing at each other with silent alarm. Her usual arrogance faltered completely. Celine's voice cracked as she tried to argue. "You can't prove. You don't understand." But the words fell flat. I had anticipated every argument, every attempt at deflection. The moral and factual upper hand was mine, and everyone in the room sensed it. Twist S13 emerged naturally from her unraveling. In a moment of frustration and panic, Celine confessed more than she intended. Admissions of favoritism, of covert attempts to discredit me over the years, of prioritizing her personal agenda above family cohesion. Her confession was inadvertent, yet comprehensive, exposing the depth of deception she had maintained. Dad's stern gaze bore into her, Mom's disappointment was palpable, and the family friends exchanged knowing looks. I remained composed, but inside, a quiet satisfaction welled up. This was the culmination of months of observation, careful strategy, and unwavering patience. Every subtle manipulation Celine had attempted, every calculated move to isolate or humiliate me, had been countered by preparation and clarity. I had not just defended myself, I had restored integrity to the room. Mom approached slowly, her expression softening as she placed a hand on my shoulder. "I see you," she murmured, her voice low but significant. I nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. Dad's gaze shifted from Celine to me, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of validation, a recognition that my perspective and my efforts mattered. Celine sank into a chair, exhausted and visibly defeated. Her usual composure had evaporated, leaving only the stark reality of exposure and consequence. The storm outside intensified, echoing the tension now resolved within these walls. I looked around, sensing the shift, family alignment, moral authority restored, and the beginning of a new equilibrium. As the evening wound down, I stood near the balcony, watching the rain streak the glass. Thoughts of the journey that led here filled me. Pain endured, intelligence applied, moral courage displayed. I understood that this night, with its revelations and reckonings, was both an ending and a beginning. The truth had been laid bare, justice had been served in its own quiet, firm way, and the wounds, though raw, had begun to be acknowledged. Morning arrived quietly, almost incongruously after the tempestuous night we had endured. The storm had passed, leaving the estate's gardens glistening under pale sunlight that filtered through the clouds. I lingered in the living room, watching Dad sit quietly in his favorite chair, a contemplative frown etched on his face. Mom hovered nearby, hesitant yet attentive, casting glances between Dad, Celine, and me. And Celine. She sat at the far end of the room, isolated, her usual aura of dominance dissolved into uneasy silence. I took a deep breath, the calm after the storm filling me with a mixture of relief and residual tension. Yesterday had been the culmination of years of subtle manipulations, betrayals, and carefully hidden truths. Today demanded something different: patience, dignity, and the delicate assertion of boundaries. "Celine," I began, my voice steady, careful not to provoke but firm enough to establish control. "We need to discuss what happened, openly and honestly, so we can all move forward." Her eyes darted toward me, defensive yet uncertain. "Venus, I don't know if there's anything to say," she murmured, her voice low. The isolation I had anticipated was real. Her allies had drifted away overnight. She faced the consequences of her actions, subtle but undeniable. Mom finally spoke, her tone measured yet warm. "Venus, perhaps we can find a way to repair what's been broken, without ignoring what happened." Her words were a quiet anchor, signaling both support and hope. I nodded, appreciating the balance between moral accountability and familial compassion. I spent the morning guiding conversations, carefully asserting my position without humiliation, ensuring that Celine understood the gravity of her actions. My voice was calm, deliberate, yet each word carried the weight of strategy and moral clarity. I reminded her, gently but firmly, that actions have consequences, both socially and legally. The subtle moral justice was essential. Celine needed to recognize her missteps, but I was not here to destroy her completely. By mid-morning, we convened in a neutral space with a family mediator and legal counsel. The conversation was measured, the air thick with accountability. Twist S14 unfolded naturally. Celine was confronted with real-world consequences, a slight financial adjustment to rectify mismanaged estate matters, and a formal acknowledgement of her misrepresentations. She acquiesced, her pride bruised, her manipulations laid bare. Watching her navigate the reality of exposure, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, tempered by fairness, not vengeance. After the mediator departed, I walked through the estate garden with Mom and a few minor family members. The morning sun cast long shadows across the paths, illuminating dewdrops on leaves. Conversation flowed cautiously, a gentle rebuilding of trust. Small steps, subtle gestures, Mom's hand brushing mine, minor siblings laughing quietly at shared memories, formed what I came to think of as the Mo Neo Hi Vong, the anchor of renewed connection. The past could not be erased, but relationships could begin to mend with patience and understanding. Alone for a moment, I reflected on the journey that had led here. Twist S15 revealed itself in my own internal reckoning. Resilience, strategic patience, and moral courage had guided every move. I understood that some wounds might never fully heal, that scars would remain, yet I was determined to navigate life with dignity and awareness. I had survived, not merely by reacting, but by anticipating, observing, and acting with integrity. And yet, Twist S16 reminded me of the complexity of human emotion. Celine was not utterly vanquished. She carried the weight of guilt and exposure, her own private reckoning. Life, I realized, was rarely black and white. Triumph and pain could coexist. Forgiveness could exist alongside accountability. Even in victory, there was room for compassion, and even in exposure, there remained the enduring complexity of human relationships. By late morning, I wandered the estate's back paths, the garden vibrant with the subtle stirrings of life after rain. Birds flitted between branches, petals glistened, and the air smelled of earth and renewal. I felt a mix of sorrow, hope, and quiet satisfaction. I had regained control of my narrative, faced deception, and emerged with clarity and moral authority. Life would not be perfect. There would still be lingering echoes of betrayal and tension, but for the first time, I felt truly in charge of my story. Before we wrap up this story, one thing is clear. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to surface. Family ties can be fragile, but integrity and patience can turn betrayal into strength. What would you do if you uncovered a secret that changes everything you thought you knew about your family? If you want to follow more stories of suspense, moral dilemmas, and revenge, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for the next chapter.